My name is Peter Calamai, and I am a recovering journalist. I'm going to talk about energy conundrums. Some people may have seen the spectacular exhibit of Dale Chihuly glass at the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Montreal. And if you did, perhaps you thought for a moment about the energy that was consumed in creating those phantasmagorical shapes. The energy of the furnace that melted the glass, the energy of the lungs that blew the glass, the energy of the arms that twisted the molten glass. Yet in fact, no energy was consumed to create that entire exhibit. No one, in fact, consumes energy. Equally, no one produces energy. That's what the first law of thermodynamics says, the law of the conservation of energy. The total energy consumption of the world is zero. What happens is that energy is converted from one form to another, and almost invariably the net quality of the energy decreases in that conversion. Highly organized energy becomes less organized, and to our way of thinking, less useful. So the energy represented in concentrated form as the gasoline in your car is converted into heat and exhaust gases, into friction between the tires and the road, and into the kinetic energy of your car's movement. When most people talk about energy production, energy consumption, energy efficiency, and indeed about energy policy, they are really talking about the carriers of energy. And that means predominantly electricity and fuels like oil, coal, and natural gas. We produce and consume these energy carriers, and in so doing, we use energy. Now, insisting on this distinction isn't mere journalistic quibbling. Using the catch-all phrase energy policy smears all the different energy carriers together and lures us into a mentality of thinking that they are interchangeable. But they aren't. You can't realistically run your computer directly on natural gas or your car on coal. As noted by Walt Patterson, who's a Canadian-born energy guru living in Britain, what's essential here is infrastructure. By that, most people mean things like refineries and power stations, which we can call energy supply infrastructure. But Patterson means more particularly buildings and lamps and motors and electronics and all those technologies that deliver what we want from energy. So let's call that the energy service infrastructure. And here we come to the first of my conundrums. There's an awful lot of both kinds of infrastructure in advanced societies like Canada, and much of it displays dynamic inertia, meaning that it strongly resists change. At the level of individuals, consider the meager inroads of the R2000 house or high-efficiency gas furnaces. At the national level, look at the tremendous existing investment in pipelines, fossil fuel-fired power plants, transmission and distribution lines, the tar sands, and so on. Any significant changes to both these infrastructure systems is going to be measured in decades. Now, unfortunately, as a nation, we have shown neither the intellectual insight nor the government's commitment towards charting a path to a national policy for sustainable use of fuel and electricity. Here is a 1979 report from the Science Council of Canada, which recommended $4 billion of R&D demonstration projects to move the country towards energy self-reliance. In hindsight, a few of the proposed projects were bang on, but the Council's conclusions and recommendations included no mention of tar sands, no mention of wind energy, and no mention of photovoltaics. 1979. This brings me to a second conundrum. 3 decades ago, we at least had a science council with well-qualified staff directed by some of the nation's preeminent scientists and business leaders. The council set its own agenda and gave its advice publicly. There is nothing like that in the federal system today. Yet such a credible, arm's-length science advice agency is essential for the process of coming to public judgment on sustainable energy use. It's going to be extraordinarily challenging to have a meaningful public dialogue about sustainable energy use. One reason for this difficulty is that many in Canada, in common with other Western democracies, don't trust their governments to be truthful or transparent, or indeed don't trust many of the existing institutions. Any such national conversation must overcome another deep-rooted obstacle, which might be considered a third conundrum. Most Canadians are in a state of denial about our country's profligate use of energy. We are the third most extravagant OECD country in per capita energy use. More telling, however, is how far we are from the various inspirational goals for sustainable energy use. A study led by the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology proposed the equivalent of using 2,000 watts per person per year. Canada is currently 5 times that. Why are we? Earlier I mentioned the poor uptake of R2000 housing and high-efficiency gas furnaces. Most people simply can't be bothered to make such changes, often because any payback isn't within their personal timeframes, and more fundamentally, because they don't accept that our existing consumption of fuels and electricity can't continue. The good news is that it's possible to change public attitudes on such matters. Many years ago, I served on an advisory committee to Environment Canada. We commissioned a study of how that most unlikely coalition of tree huggers and duck hunters made acid rain a top-of-mind issue for average Canadians. It turns out they did so by applying the lessons from social science research. So if I were drawing up a roadmap for a sustainable energy future for Canada, I'd start by enrolling the best minds from the social sciences to help shape that essential national dialogue. I'd then shame governments to lead the way by upgrading the public infrastructure across the entire country. Imagine every publicly owned building from office towers to prisons as a model of energy efficiency. And finally, I'd remind policymakers that the history of science strongly suggests that the advances needed for a sustained energy future in Canada will most probably come from curiosity-driven research and not from the targeted, directed R&D that is now the mantra. People like our current governing federal party are disdainful of letting scientists explore what they consider useless questions. In the mid-19th century, one such useless question was why things change color as they heat up. The answer led to quantum mechanics, and from there to transistors and to semiconductors. Some of the solutions to our energy conundrums will probably be found by researchers also exploring such useless questions. Thank you very much.